Thank you, Scott, and thanks everybody for coming here. I just want to start, if there isn't a deep appreciation of it, I live in Connecticut, I teach in Pennsylvania, but I have to say that this state has some extraordinary leadership, from the governor and Stephen Pryor, your Commerce Secretary, and Scott, and great civic leadership, great business leadership. I don't live in Rhode Island, but I spend a lot of time here. I'm on the board of the Herreshoff Marine Museum in Bristol, and I'm a sailor, and I've owned a Herreshoff sloop, or we've had Herreshoff sloops all of our lives, and have always found ourselves in Narragansett Bay one way or another, every summer since I was about 8 years old. So I have a real connection to this place, even though I don't live here. And what I'm here to talk about today is this idea of how we get Rhode Island and New England to the next plateau. And I worked for Mike Dukakis back in the 70s and 80s, and worked in the Blackstone Valley to create the Blackstone Valley Heritage Park and what is now the National Park. And like all of us, I guess, in the room, I've seen New England's economy, have its dips and then its recoveries, and we're in one of these recovery periods now. And one of the things I've learned, and I guess those of us who've been with this for the long haul know that you can't take it for granted. That our success at the moment doesn't mean that we're going to continue to thrive unless we look to the future and take the kinds of steps that Governor Raimondo outlined a few moments ago. And I'll go beyond that. One other thought, and I think this is one of the themes here, is that in all of almost everything in life, there are no silver bullets. I learned this in New York, that when I started a regional plan in 1989, and I went there at a time when New York was given up as ungovernable, and we got to downsize the city and let's write off the Bronx, and how we'd lost a million residents and almost a million jobs at that point. In my office, I had what I called my Death of New York bookshelf, with a series of titles: The Decline of New York, The End of New York. We had the Blade Runner, DVD and so forth. And people forget now that the Robert Moses biography, The Power Broker, the subtitle was Robert Moses and the Decline of New York. Well, a very funny thing happened on the way to the funeral in New York, and it's the same thing that's happened here in Rhode Island. A courageous group of business and civic and government leaders got together and said, we need to bootstrap this place back to what it was and what it should be, and that's been fabulously successful. I led we've done 2 regional plans since I was started at RPA, that laid out more than $100 billion of capital investments in our subways, our commuter rail systems, our parks, our public water supplies, and other systems and so forth. And we've made those investments, and it really does pay off, that kind of long-range thinking. And we heard, from the governor that that's the way Rhode Island is thinking. So how do we get to the next plateau? And that's really what Rebooting New England is about. It's really about building the next economy. I started looking around for a succinct diagram. We can go to the next image, and we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. And I'll just I don't have a clicker here. So I've got a very erudite image that was put together by a colleague's grandson. On the New England economy. It's all here. We got computers in the upper left-hand corner, and submarines in Groton, and all the other things that make New England's economy work. We've got education and fishing and farming and so forth. But actually, life's gotten a little more complicated recently. We have a regional economy here that is bounded by New York and Boston, and then a collection of mid-sized cities, including Providence, and there are more than a dozen places of over 100,000 people across New England. Providence is doing pretty well because of its good leadership, and also because of its connections to Boston. And Boston is booming and New York is booming and so forth. But what I'm going to be talking about is the fact that our connections to these big places have frayed in recent years. That our both rail connections and our roadway connections to these big cities that are drivers of the global economy and the national economy have frayed. And you'll hear, sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Next, please. Yep. Here we go. This is the image that, big places at each end of the economy. And let me introduce Kip Bergstrom down here, who spent a lot of time here at Rhode Island in the 70s and 80s working on economic development issues. And Kip is mine. So this project is what happens when you have 2 underemployed guys with time on their hands. and so forth. At any rate, so this is really about how we build on the theme that James Fallow has outlined here of how to rebuild the economy of these mid-sized cities. And I really agree with Mr. Fallows that these places really are becoming the new engines of the national economy. And we've got to give New England's mid-sized cities a little bit of a leg up on that process. A little bit of, these are what I call my eyewash slides. I like to, I said this to Stephen Pryor before I came in, that nobody moves to Rhode Island or New England because of its salubrious climate or because it's a low-cost place to live or do business or the taxes are low or anything else. People move here because it's a really interesting and good place to live and work. We have fabulous bones in these cities, great infrastructure, and extraordinary architecture and urban fabric. Providence and Rhode Island have this special place in this country. This is the place where we learn to live together and to embrace immigrants and to embrace diversity more than any other place in the country. I would suggest that New York was the other one, and that was more accidental. It was those kind of money-grubbing Dutch folks down there who said, we really don't care who comes here as long as they build our economy. I spent some time wrestling Governor's Island in New York Harbor away from Donald Trump about 20 years ago. He wanted to, we have this fabulous historic island with, a national register, national landmarks and so forth. He wanted to build 3 high-rise towers. I wanted to build a new cultural center and a new park. I called it Central Park, but with a larger water feature. And the reason it was called Governor's Island is that when the English took over New Amsterdam, the English governors arrived in Lower Manhattan, and there were people from 19 countries speaking a dozen languages. There were Muslims and Jews and Baptists and other exotic people here, and they couldn't handle it, so they put the governor's mansion not on Manhattan Island, but on Governor's Island, so they could be, close but not too close. Well, Rhode Island is the place where we learn to embrace diversity, and it's so important in the current and the next America that we do this. And so there's this great story here that we need to tell the rest of the world about and build upon. We have this great industrial history in the Blackstone Valley and elsewhere in the state. We invented the Industrial Revolution in this country. We industrial espionage. We borrowed it from the Brits, thank you, but we took it and ran with it and made something of it. And of course we have this extraordinary natural setting, and this is where my connections have been. This is Newport and the Ida Lewis Yacht Club in the foreground and the New York Yacht Club, and boy, life is grand down there. What's the problem? And of course we have this extraordinary collection of higher educational institutions with Brown and URI and Johnson and Wales and all the others. But despite, and these numbers are about 3 years old, and they don't reflect the kind of progress that's been made in the last few years here. Despite the progress that's been made in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we're still, lagging the rest of the country in a number of indicators. And the good news here in Rhode Island is that household income is way up, but in terms of job creation, the rest of New England is not doing as well as you are. And we've learned that when you take Boston out of the statewide indicators in Massachusetts, that the rest of Massachusetts is not doing as well as Rhode Island certainly, or the rest of New England. Our population growth has been slower than New York and Boston and the rest of the country. We've continued to have an outmigration across New England and particularly of the bright young people who drive innovation. You guys have done a terrific job. Governor Raimondo, I think, is a model for how governors can wrestle long-term issues like pension costs and health care costs to the ground and so forth. So, you're still not in the top tier of the country. Connecticut is the 50 among the states in its fiscal health. We're just ahead of Puerto Rico, so we can't say that we're number one, but we're, and of course the rest of the region is also not doing well. This is the old, economy this is a scene from Western Massachusetts and some scenes from the Blackstone Valley when I was working on the Heritage Park back in the 80s and 70s and 80s. And some other scenes from the Blackstone Valley. This is the Crown and Eagle Mill, where there was a terrible fire in 1975. It's now affordable housing, mixed income housing. The Slaterville Mill, same thing. We've done a good job of preserving this heritage. When you look across the region, Rhode Island is doing better than the rest of New England, but New England is still lagging the national economy in employment growth and population growth. And the real problem, I think, or one of the issues that we need to address is how to strengthen the connections to these engines of the national and global economy in Boston and New York. And these connections have been frayed over the years. Instead of having a unified economy, a super connected economy across New England, we've ended up with this more fragmented economy and fragmented mobility system. And the biggest problem is, of course, the congestion in the highway network here in Rhode Island. I was in LA with my students earlier in the month, and it just dawned on me. We had a dinner at the California Club in downtown LA. People came in from all over, and the region, and one of our guests came in from Pacific Palisades. It's 12 miles away. It took her 2.5 hours to get into downtown LA. But that's not at all atypical of what's going on in metropolitan America. Our grandparents built the interstate highway system. They oversized everything. Our generation, we baby boomers, the millennials are going to have real trouble with us, I think, when they realize just how we've neglected these things. They overbuilt these systems, gave us the capacity that we would need for half a century or so, and guess what? Half a century's up, and the highway system across New England and across the country in metropolitan places has congealed. This wonderful graphic from the Boston Globe earlier this week that, oh God, I'm way behind. We're catching. We're here. We've caught up on increasing delays in highway commutes here in eastern Massachusetts, and I guess the same is true. Well, I came in from Tiverton this morning, and the traffic jam begins, as you know, around Seekonk someplace, coming in every morning. So the average Bostonian now spends 60 hours, every year sitting in traffic. 2-hour increase in just a year and a half. The one to look at here is the one in the middle on the right, which is the bus commute from Fairhaven, which is not that far away, to the Back Bay, which is now 40 minutes longer than it was just 10 years ago. I mean, this is just and this is just beginning this trend. So this. I would argue that it's it's not the lifeline for Rhode Island, but it's a really important one, that we have a really strong connection to Boston. We have an opportunity too, because and you'll hear in a moment that we're proposing to build this high-performance rail connection across New England, that these trains it's incredible, will actually run in both directions, and there's an enormous opportunity as Boston and New York become more congested and more expensive and so forth, to have an overspill of jobs and population come out into the mid-sized cities across New England. This is I-95 in Stamford, Connecticut, where I used to live. And where Kip used to work, but it could be I-95 in Rhode Island or in Massachusetts. This is Connecticut's lifeline to New York, the Merritt Parkway in the upper left-hand corner, and in the lower right is I-95. And Governor Malloy, very colorful turn of phrase, says that Connecticut's lifeline to New York is the Merritt Parkway and I-95. The first one is a museum, and the second one is a parking lot. And it's very hard to have that be your economic lifeline to the biggest economy in the world. And the rail system is not much better. This is the New Haven line, one of the bridges. There are 4 of these quote movable bridges, but they tend not to move a lot of the time, and they have to have people out there with crowbars to get them back in place when they get stuck in an open position. The T is not much better. The only electrified line is the one between Providence and Boston. The rest of it is diesel, and it's basically 60, 70, 80-year-old signaling systems and power systems and rights-of-way and so forth. So Kip and I set out to say, well, what can we do to fix this? I ran a studio last year at the University of Pennsylvania, where they encouraged me to do it. A little plug for Penn. I teach there because it's Benjamin Franklin's university. It's a university, the first secular university in America. It was established by Mr. Franklin to focus on the issues and needs of an advanced economy, and that's what we continue to do. So we took a look, and this is Kip here on the left, and yours truly on the right. I'm at Stonehenge, and that's where a lot of my friends think that I belong. And but we went for inspiration to look at what do you do to fix the economy of the small and mid-sized cities of New England and get them to the next plateau. We went to the United Kingdom to look at what we think is a precedent for what we should be doing here, thinking about here. And it's a project that was begun several years ago by the British government called the Northern Powerhouse. And this is a national initiative. They're investing in the neighborhood of $100 billion to do two things. One is essentially to revitalize the economy of the older industrial cities of the north of England that are very similar in history and industrial history and their economic performance to the mid-sized cities of New England. And cities like Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds and Sheffield and Newcastle, they've been through the same kind of story that we have. These are the great industrial powerhouses of the United Kingdom and the British Empire. After the Second World War, they lost their manufacturing base and have struggled to regain their footing and to bring in the new industries to replace them. This is the comparative geography of the UK and New England at the same scale. London in the lower right-hand corner here with the blue blob there, that's London, and of course it's about the size of New York, about almost 9 million people, same as New York, and then these northern cities in red here. These are the populations of the urban core and the immediate inner ring suburbs in both places. And their cities are a little larger than ours are, but not really out of line. And of course, we've got a better economic geography here because we're situated right between New York and Boston. They've got London to the south, and they really don't have the same kind of economic engine to the north that we do. So again, the history was really quite similar. They invented the Industrial Revolution in England. We did the same thing here. They had this long decline, and their strategy started with a project called HS2, High Speed Rail 2. HS1 is the Channel Tunnel rail link to France. HS2 is the London to the North rail link that goes north and splits basically in Birmingham and goes up to Manchester and Liverpool in the west, and then a leg goes up to Sheffield and Leeds and Newcastle to the east. And it's basically about cutting travel times, currently about 3 hours from London to these places, and it takes the travel time down to about an hour. New right-of-way, entirely new route, and they decided to build it because the motorways linking the north of England to the southeast were totally gummed up. The rail lines were at capacity, even though they put a lot of money into rebuilding the classic rail lines and so forth, more than we've done. So they were still really stuck and said, well, why don't the Southeast is booming. It's got the same issues that Boston and New York have with congestion and rising housing prices and so forth. Why don't we reattach the North to the Southeast and see if we can bring them into the economic agglomeration of the Southeast? They didn't really think about the economic development implications. They said, let's go ahead and build the railroad. And then George Osborne, when he came in as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasury Secretary, really the number 2 guy in the government, in the conservative government that took over 4 or 5 years ago, is from the north of England. And he said, well, let's make sure we have a really solid economic development strategy to go with this. And out of that emerged a not-for-profit group called the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, which is led by business leaders, but it includes the mayors of these cities. And they've now put together a very thoughtful and we think effective economic development strategy that we can learn from. And this is the vision for the Northern Powerhouse Rail Network. So it's HS2 linking these places to London, and then it's HS3, a new high-speed rail line that goes from Liverpool to Manchester and Sheffield and Leeds and the other cities in the Newcastle, the other cities in the Northeast. And you can see the frequency here, 6 trains an hour, 8 trains an hour, and the journey times, essentially being cut by 2/3 in some some cases between these cities. They're all being brought, the core of the northern powerhouse region, they're all being brought within 30 or 40 minutes of each other in travel times that used to be a couple of hours apart. So the takeaways for us, and there are really 5. The first one is that you can build an economic development strategy for a region like this one that is dominated by mid-sized cities by rebuilding the connections to the big global cities at each end of the region, and that rail network, we're calling it a high-performance rail network, can underpin the economic transformation of a region like New England. The second thing is that you need to focus on skills. There's a big attention to labor skills at the K through 12 level and adult education and so forth. But the idea here is to create larger agglomeration economies so that Providence by itself doesn't have the kind of throw power to compete effectively with Boston, but when it's connected with Hartford and New Haven and the other mid-sized cities across New England, it gives us the opportunity to attract talent and to attract businesses who might look to other larger places. The third thing is, and this is a term that Kip and I both like, the idea is focusing on what they call the prime capabilities, the growth sectors in the national and regional economy, and they're very similar to the ones that we have here: biotech, financial and business services, IT, advanced manufacturing, and materials. The other elements of the strategy go way beyond just infrastructure, and obviously having a leadership group that's thinking strategically about the future of the region is a really important thing. But beyond that, they're investing in research universities and in technology transfer institutions that take advanced technologies out of the laboratories and out of the classrooms and get them into the local economy, something that we're not as good at here. There's a real focus on urban amenity and housing and local transport systems and so forth, so that the cities themselves can be remagnetized in much the same way that Providence has already done. Focus on lifelong skills for displaced workers. So if you go to Sheffield, for example, they have programs to train displaced steel workers for the new economy and advanced materials and so forth. Governance reform, and this is something Kip and I have been running a series of roundtable discussions across New England. We were in Western Mass a few weeks ago, and this one I always feel like I need to duck and cover and get behind the podium when I say this, but we need to be thinking about creating more efficient units of government here. We have it's close to 1,000 units of local government in across New England, and I live in a little town. We're very proud of our green and all the rest of it, but we're just not organized in a very efficient way. We can't do the big things of economic development and transport and so forth. So what they've done in England is to incentivize the creation of what they call combined authorities. These are regional governments that are like the Greater London Authority. They have a limited number of responsibilities: economic development, transport. We were in Manchester. Kip and I have been over a few times. They've just regionalized the police and fire services across Greater Manchester. They've done it for economic reasons. Tough to do, but in fact they're getting efficiencies that they didn't have before. And then finally, this idea of creating a nonprofit, a non-governmental organization, the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, to coordinate a broad region-wide economic development strategy. And the last thing are these set of capital investments, $100 billion of investments in transport and unkinking some of the bottlenecks in the highway system and so forth, the motorway system, and all of which is being done with UK government debt. And I'm going to get back to that. I felt like when I met with the guy in the Prime Minister's office who was dealing with the finances here, it's like the scene in Fawlty Towers where John Cleese, is saying, "Fire? Remember that one?" And he's saying, "Debt," very quietly, so nobody listen. Debt? Did he really say debt? So what are the takeaways? Again, 6 things. One is that we really ought to be thinking about building a similar rail network here between New York and Boston. Similar to the one that they're now in the process of building in the United Kingdom. We need to decongest highways, we need to expand rail ridership, and we need to give drivers real alternatives, and not just a train an hour or a train that takes you to someplace you don't really want to go to, but the kind of high-performance system that there are now 34 countries with high-speed rail networks. We're behind Morocco and Malaysia and Indonesia, and I can go down the list of places we shouldn't be behind. Turkey, can I keep going? And if you go to in Europe or in Japan or China, you'll see, go to Tokyo Station, and the high-speed Shinkansen trains leave every 5 minutes between these cities. Okay, I can keep going. Integrate labor and housing markets, revitalize the mid-sized cities. That's the core goal of this entire program. Promoting a focus on the prime capabilities, the growth industries in the region and the country. And then the final thing is this idea of creating the world's largest innovation network between New York and Boston, so we can create synergies between all of these cities and connections with all of these cities. And this isn't a fight with Boston and New York. This is about creating synergies with Boston and New York. And Kip identified this, which I thought was pretty interesting. It was a real hit when we had our forum in Hartford. If you drew a 150-mile circle around every city in America, the largest number of innovation companies, tech companies in the world, would be the Silicon Valley, but actually Hartford is number 2, and we have the opportunity to make Hartford number 1 by reconnecting it with New York and Boston. So what's the rail network look like? We're looking for a high-speed line between New York and Boston with a 100-minute travel time between New York and Boston, high-speed commuter services. We're looking at something like 12 to 13 trains an hour in each direction. So 3 or 4 high-speed trains between New York and Boston, and then a whole set of high-speed commuter services between intermediate cities. And then we want to create a network that links all of the mid-sized cities, going up to Bangor and Brattleboro and Concord, New Hampshire, and so forth. And let's see, where are we? And this image here, this is the Federal Railroad Administration proposal for the Northeast Corridor, which landed like a dull thud when it came out last year, because they said to avoid litigation and controversy, they said, let's build a new right-of-way between Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and Kenyon, Rhode Island, and nobody will notice. And a funny thing happened. Oh yeah, and then put 2 new tracks in Fairfield County, where the nice people in Darien and Westport and Greenwich won't notice, and they noticed. And so, it's really hard to get 4 United States senators to threaten to tie themselves to the tracks, but that's what happened. Interestingly, there's an alternative alignment that FRA looked at. It was originally proposed by my Penn studio a dozen years ago, which went east on Long Island, where there's a right-of-way that works under Long Island Sound in a tunnel that is about 14 miles long, which is shorter than about 20 rail tunnels in the world, and then goes north from Hartford, from New Haven to Hartford, and then in a new inland route between Hartford and Providence. We've identified a right-of-way that we think works and makes sense, and that is cost-effective. There'd be a stop at Yukon and to connect Yukon with the rest of the world, and then up to Boston. And again, 100-minute travel times. We've got a map here that shows you what the travel times would be. This is the main line, the dark line here. We're listening to people about phasing. The folks in Connecticut said that the New Haven line between New Haven and New York is a real priority for them, but there are other priorities as we move around New England. The first layer, the high-speed rail link. The second layer is what we're calling high-performance rail. These are 80, 90 mile per hour services, and I'm almost done, Scott. And then a set of regional connections so that all of these cities come together. We think this would handle something like 80 to 100,000 passengers a day on the main line, and you can see that there'd be smaller numbers of passengers between the mid-sized cities. Outcomes: cutting travel times, integrating labor markets, reintegrating the economies of the mid-sized cities across the region, focusing development in center cities because that's where the stations would be, rebuilding the tax base, reduced carbon. And the idea is to go from this with a set of independent cities with not much to do with each other to this, with a dense labor market that stretches from, and that was fast, and project delivery. It's not cheap, about $100 billion, and I'm sure people think, like, what's wrong with these people? Don't you read the newspapers? We propose that we have a lot of confidence in the Federal Railroad Administration, but not that much confidence, so we're proposing that we do what the Brits have done and create a new agency that would be called Transport for New England, a joint venture between the 6 New England states and the federal government. we're proposing that the federal government pay for most of this. And again, I know you think we're probably crazy, but again, the idea is that the federal share could be financed with U.S. Treasury debt, which is what the UK government is doing. This is my question for the day. If conservatives in the United Kingdom can use debt, and they basically, when I spoke to the folks in the Prime Minister's office, how can you do this? And they said, we looked at the history of 400 years of UK Treasury debt, and we said, going back to Drake's Armada, or to fight the Spanish Armada, he said, interest rates have never been lower, capital has never been more available. We're selling UK Treasury debt on global markets. 90% of it's purchased by foreign governments, foreign sovereign wealth funds. And it's all sterling denominated, no treasury risk. So if the Brits can do that, can we do this? We think that we can. The benefits, somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion worth of benefits, a 2.5 to 1 benefit cost ratio, lots of additional travel time savings, environment, climate, and all the other benefits that you would hope, and ultimately the increased federal and state tax revenues that you use to pay back the debt. So next steps is conversations like this, engaging people here in Providence and elsewhere across New England, reaching out to the New England congressional delegation. The power of this thing, we think, let me just try this out on people, that we have 6 states here in New England and a 7th in New York that have a long history of not working together. We understand that. But imagine if we could get 12 or 14 United States senators voting as a bloc, and we saw what happened when Susan Collins raised her hand on the health care thing, or the Obamacare thing. So that's the idea, and secure our share of whatever emerging federal infrastructure program comes out this year or next year, this White House or the next one probably. Establish this agency to manage it and deliver the project, and convene a not-for-profit group to run the whole thing. And we have a last slide which goes on to, here it is. Thank you. And that's it.